Right now, we'll talk some MMA, a little bit of boxing, because we have the guy who's known as the best amateur boxer of all time, also did pretty well in the pros, Howard Davis Jr. He was Chuck Liddell's head boxing trainer going into last night's fight. Howard, first of all, thank you for coming out here. You were live in studio. I appreciate your time.
Pleasure being here, Alex.
Yeah, and so obviously we're disappointed about what happened last night. I know that you worked a lot with Chuck, and all accounts were saying that Chuck had one of the best camps he'd had in his life. But I mean, to me, I wasn't so sure if he stuck with the game plan. I mean, it just didn't seem like that was the old Chuck. It seemed like he was a little bit off. And I know that he had a great camp, but sometimes how well a guy does in camp doesn't necessarily translate to how he does in the actual fight. And even Chuck said after the fight he didn't really feel like himself. I don't know what your impression was, Howard, of the way Chuck looked last night.
Well, it was really a disappointing night for me. I stayed with Chuck for 8 weeks at his house. I trained him every day. He trained extremely hard, didn't overtrain. He did everything I asked of him. He did everything that the other trainers asked of him. And he performed at a high level in training camp, but sometimes that doesn't always translate into a fight, especially if you're doing something different. I always believe it takes anywhere between 3 to 6 months to actually change a fighter to what you want him to be as a fighter. And I was there for 8 weeks, and I guess obviously it wasn't enough time. Chuck has been doing this for 16, 17 years. And I guess the old saying is it's very hard to train an old dog to do new tricks.
I mean, that's kind of the impression that I got, because I know that I'm sure being the boxing guy that you are, you worked with Chuck's hands, you worked with his head movement, and it just kind of seemed to me like he reverted to the old Chuck Liddell and maybe wasn't defending himself the right way. Now, I know that obviously he took a big shot from Mauricio Shogun Rua, and one of the things I was wondering was, of course, Chuck, for the past several years, he's been training kind of the same way with John Hackelman and the guys over there at the Pit in California, and he decided to bring you in and bring some guys in from American Top Team to work on his boxing and his jiu-jitsu in a different way. What was Chuck's motivation for really changing up his training camp for that fight? I mean, I don't know if Chuck looked at that as being really his last chance at getting a signature win and getting back on the map.
Well, I looked at some fight films of his last couple fights, and one of the things I noticed that when he throws his right hand, his right foot comes forward. And when that happens, you're easily taken down, or you're easily hit with a counter shot.
Or it might be easy to telegraph that way as well.
Exactly. And last night he did it again. His right foot came forward, and down he went twice from Shogun. And that's one of the things I was working with him on, not to do that. And throughout the training camp for 8 weeks, he didn't do it. But, just like I said before, it doesn't always translate into the fight.
So Chuck got dropped by that big left hand by Shogun, and Shogun followed him to the ground and followed it up with a few extra punches, but it was really over after he took that big left hand and fell to the canvas there. Was there anything Chuck could have done differently in that second in time to avoid taking that big shot?
Well, that's funny you should say about the left hook, because one of the things we were working on was moving to the right and blocking the left hook. And I worked with him every single day, and I threw left hooks at him. He blocked them consistently every single day for 8 weeks. I went over it over and over again. But as I was watching the fight, I saw his hands go lower and lower, and he didn't do that in training camp. One thing he did do was move to the right. I did notice that. But his hands went right back to what he normally does. And, sometimes it doesn't... sometimes a fighter doesn't digest everything when it's time for them to fight. They digest it in camp, but when it comes to fight, they go right back to their comfort zone.
Yeah, it really seems like that's what happened to Chuck last night. Alex Dono with you here on 790 The Ticket, talking to Howard Davis Jr. out of American Top Team, Olympic gold medalist in '76, also in Montreal. So Chuck Liddell was back in your stomping grounds. And something you guys should know about Howard, he worked with Chuck Liddell diligently for the past 2 months. You even lived with Chuck, didn't you?
Yeah, I stayed in his house. I watched what he did, watched how he trained, watched how he ate. We talked every single day, and got really close to the guy. I really got to know who he really is. He's a wonderful guy, man. Good heart, loves his children. I watched him around his children. He's really diligent about his children, and he's a caring guy. He's really nice guy. I didn't know much about Chuck, until I went to his house, and I really got to see what kind of character he has.
Now, did you have like a curfew for Chuck? Is he a guy who likes to party in the months before the fight? I mean, he had you living there trying to keep him in line. I mean, did you ever have to tell him, maybe don't invite so many girls over tonight, let's try to keep the parties to a minimum? Because I've heard some stories about Chuck that sometimes, in the weeks before the fights, he tends to go a little bit crazy.
Well, no, he was pretty cool about that. He went to bed early. He did everything I asked him to do. There's no excuse, really. He did everything he's supposed to do.
Now, one of the issues, Howard Davis Jr. joins us live in studio. One of the issues that some of the analysts are bringing up, and this is something I can't really speak on myself because I haven't fought professionally, so, it's nice to have an expert like you, a guy who you would never know it to look at your face, but you've been punched in the face more than most of us have, so maybe you can shed some light on this, Howard. I mean, Chuck Liddell, he's lost 4 of his last 5 fights, and 3 of them were either by knockout or technical knockout. Now, this is a guy who didn't really get knocked around too much earlier in his career. I've heard people say that after you suffer 1 or 2 heavy knockouts, that your chin is never really the same after that. Now, I know this wasn't really an issue for you, but did you ever know guys who maybe suffered some brutal knockouts? Because we had Chuck knocked out pretty badly by Rampage Jackson a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
He took a pretty bad shot from Rashad Evans less than a year ago, and now he takes a big left hook from Mauricio Shogun Hua. I mean, is there any truth to the argument that after you get really knocked out once, is there what people call a knockout memory, that really your chin is never the same after that, and if you get a shot square to the chin again, then you're going to tend to knock out easier than you used to?
Well, I spoke to some neurosurgeons and people that expert on brain anatomy, and they say sometime when you get knocked out and you get a concussion, you get scar tissue in the brain. And normally, when you get hit again, because of the scar tissue, you don't take the same kind of punch.
Man, just scar tissue on the brain, that just scares me to even think about it.
Yeah, well, anytime you get hit and you see the flash of white light, there's always potential of getting scar tissue on the brain, which is essentially brain damage. And the brain doesn't take a punch as well.
So, Howard, before we go on to what you're up to now, one more question concerning Chuck. The disappointing fight last night. Now he's lost 4 out of his past 5, 3 of those by either knockout or TKO. And so he's had kind of a disappointing run in the light heavyweight division here. Even, Joe Rogan in the post-fight interview was kind of, poking him with the stick a little bit, prodding him to see if he might plan to retire after this. You're a guy who now, over intensive time spent with Chuck Liddell, you've become a good friend of his. I don't know how much you've talked to him since the fight last night. I can't imagine it's, a really good time to talk to him this early, but if you had to make your best educated guess, do you think Chuck Liddell is done? Do you think he retires while he still has pretty good memories of being on top very recently, or do you think Chuck is going to try to keep going?
Well, he called me last night after the fight, and he apologized for his performance. And I told him, I said, it's okay, these things happen. And I asked him what is he going to do. He says he doesn't know, and that's only the right thing to say because he just lost. You need time to think about it. Also, it's a personal issue. I'm not going to sit here and tell the man to retire. It's definitely a personal issue, and that's something he has to decide with himself, his family, and his longtime trainer, John Hackleman.
There is a speculation now that Chuck Liddell, being a pretty big guy, naturally sizable guy who still has some decent speed, any chance he might consider maybe moving up to heavyweight where the waters aren't so deep there in the heavyweight division and maybe trying his hand there, being one of the faster guys at heavyweight. Now, I know obviously the tide has shifted a little bit. You have monstrous guys like Brock Lesnar and Shane Carwin who have to cut weight to get to 265, but I think there might be any prospect that Chuck Liddell, being, still a quick guy with a lot of power, might try his luck at heavyweight, kind of like Randy Couture did a few years ago where the waters aren't so deep.
Well, it's funny you should say, but on the other end of that, I discussed with him about moving down in weight.
Yeah, to middleweight.
Yeah, because he's really, if you look at his body, he's really not a 206-pounder, 206-pounder. I see a lot more weight coming off on him. I see him a lot quicker if he got down to 180.
Well, he's always had a little bit of a gut, but a lot of people say maybe that's more of a natural gut than anything else. I mean, it looks like he maybe dropped a few beers the night before the fight.
No, that's just the way he's built.
That's what I figured.
Part of his genetics. But he still can lose some weight. I think 185 is probably a good weight for him. It'll take a little time to do it, but I think he'll fight better at that weight.